All set.
All right, let's convene our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for March 8th, 2022 at 6:30 or just a minute or two after. We do have a quorum. Thanks to the other planning commissioners for being here tonight. And welcome to everybody else who's here to join us. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it?
It's not really a change, but I just want to make sure it's clear up front that we will not be asking you to take the actions that were suggested on the agenda. We'll be providing this as an opportunity to go over the proposed documents and have questions and discussion with you. We didn't send them out far enough in advance for the expectation that you'll be able to move them forward tonight. So,
okay, that sounds good. Then our agenda is as it's stated. So item 2 now is public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to come and speak to us on any item that you'd like. If it's one that's coming up on our agenda, you could either speak now or there should be an opportunity later, but we welcome your comments now. And I think Sharon is here, Sharon Busher.
Yeah, Sharon, you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak.
I have unmuted myself. Thank you. Thank you. This evening, I'm pretty interested in your two topics. And the one on interim emergency shelters is the one that I want to speak to. Certainly, I care very deeply about the Burlington High School rezoning or zoning overlay. And I like what I read. I think it gives flexibility. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm going to learn and listen tonight. As far as the interim emergency shelters, and these are temporary, as I read, not permanent, different process for permanent. My question is, it's proposed that this be done administratively. And that always begs the question, when something's done administratively, sometimes the public is totally caught off guard. And then there are challenges and negativity that could have been avoided if the public was informed. Now, I know that they're looking for a site or sites, but I'm hoping that even though it may not be part of the ordinance, there would be some type of public notification to address or prevent some of this backlash that we've seen, and more support for what is being proposed. So that's really all I had to say about the proposal. Anything that's done administratively, I always kind of worry about. And I have an experience that happened on my street years and years ago when I don't even think I was on the city council, where something was approved administratively, and it really had negative ramifications. And at that point, this was something that if the neighbors could have appealed, they would have, but they didn't know in time. And so it really played out in a very bad financial way for the neighborhood. So I'm really looking at someone speaking to that piece and understanding that better. Other than that, I'm pretty excited about these shelter pods and the fact that we may have something to offer people in desperate need of shelter. So thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, Sharon. Megan, is there anyone else?
There are two other people that have since joined. I don't see anybody raising their hand, but I'll wait just a second if anybody else would like to speak during public forum. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, Andy, so I think we can move on.
Okay, so we'll close item 2, which was the public forum. Item 3 is the chair's report. I don't have anything to report tonight, so we'll go to item 4, which is director's report. Megan.
Okay, just a couple of updates for you tonight. I shared at the last meeting that the Council Ordinance Committee was going to take up your comments on their proposal to revise our parking standards. So the Ordinance Committee met last week and they're meeting again this week to discuss that amendment. Most of the comments that were shared with the Ordinance Committee by the Planning Commission were accepted by the committee. many of the kind of detailed updates and edits that we made together in reviewing the ordinance language. There were a couple of exceptions. One is that they did not want to exempt the maximum parking limits for the forum districts downtown. I think as many of us probably expected, they wanted to talk more about the recommendations around the TDM and the Planning Commission's recommendation not to codify those standards at this time. They had some questions about it. There was a lot of discussion about it amongst the committee members. And I think ultimately they may consider revising what was in the ordinance a little bit, raising the threshold for where the TDM standards would apply across the city, and maybe considering a scaled back kind of suite of recommendations for TDM in certain parts. So we're going to talk to them a little bit more about that later this week and see where they end up with that discussion. And then I think,
Megan, if just to ask a question on that one, and others may have questions as well. But is what they're thinking of doing is just a scaled back thing without taking the deeper dive into it?
They're supportive of taking the deeper dive into it. I think there are some counselors that would like to see there be some sort of TDM standard if they're changing the parking regulations at this time. So I think that was part of the idea. If they scaled back or kind of increased the thresholds for when they might apply, I think they were thinking that it might address some of the concerns that the Planning Commission shared about either the scale or appropriateness in some parts of the city.
Thanks.
You're welcome. And they're going to talk more about how the changes to the joint institutional parking management plan process work with the switch from minimums to maximums. They had a lot of questions about what that would mean and kind of what some of the standards are that are included in the JIP process for the institutions. So I'll let you know where they end up with that after their discussion this week. One other item that this commission, I've tried to keep you in the loop on, is just where the short-term rental ordinance has gone since it left your committee. I reported at your last meeting that the council had actually adopted a version of the Chapter 18 amendments that had been refined since you had worked on it. Last week, or actually earlier this week, I'm sorry, all the days feel like they're running together. Earlier this week at the council meeting, the mayor did share communication with the council that indicated he's considering vetoing that amendment. So they may discuss that at their meeting on the 21st. And I shared before that we had a principal planner that was going to be joining us. They're actually starting next Monday. So I'm very excited. It'll be a busy week onboarding them virtually, but I'm really happy and excited to have a new planner joining our team very soon. So that's all I have for you.
Great. Well, good news. Thank you. Move on to item 5, which is proposed CDO amendment for interim emergency shelters. And who's taking this one? Is Samantha, you taking this, or Megan?
So I'm gonna ask Samantha to start us off with this one. I introduced Samantha, I think before everybody was here, but Samantha is the, well, she's not so new anymore. Samantha is the Assistant Director of Community Works in CEDO. She's been with the city since the fall, and is taking the lead on a number of projects that came out of the 10-point housing action plan that I have presented an overview of with you before. So Samantha's going to talk to us about this effort around the shelter pods and talk a little bit about why this zoning amendment is coming to you, and then I can walk you through what the amendment actually says.
Great.
Megan, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's nice to meet you all, and thanks for taking the time to learn about this tonight. So as Megan said, and I think the sort of overview in the materials stated, this is an effort that has been sort of a priority for the city actually for a couple of years, but sort of got raised up in priority with the closing of Sears Lane, a recognition that this problem since that of homelessness has, tripled since COVID began. And while there are a lot of resources coming to the state for permanent affordable housing, it's really going to take a lot of several years for those new units to come online. And there's a real emergency right now with the number of unsheltered people who are living in Chittenden County and in Burlington. The good news with lots of work from people on the ground around Sears Lane is most of the folks that were there were able to be relocated into motel rooms through that existing program. None of those motel rooms are located in Burlington because we don't have an eligible motel, and that program is ending on April 1st. So those folks that were successfully relocated are going to be coming back to the city very soon. We have been working hard to try to do something quickly. As Megan said, I am quite new to the city, and it's taking me some, the process is, there's a lot of processes to move through, but I'm really excited to be able to report that the city council did approve an ARPA allocation for getting the infrastructure and getting these shelters set up. So we're on the right track. The reason this amendment, I had requested this amendment with Megan is, I think, realizing as I was trying to work with the zoning office that this is definitely a project that we could probably, work through the normal process, getting conditional use approval and going through the DRB. It's a really heavy lift that's a very intense permitting process for something that is going to be temporary. And it really, so there's a lot of effort required to meet those requirements, and just the time. I think as many as you know, it's the DRB's schedule is already full for the month of April. There's a lot of demand on that DRB, and that both the intensity of the application and the time required to even get in front of the DRB make it hard for us to get these shelters in place as quickly as we need them. And this amendment, I think Megan and I had actually talked about right after I started, is based on a zoning ordinances, a number of them, mostly one in Seattle that's been quite successful they have a number of these communities and use this type of ordinance to ensure that as many people could get sheltered as quickly as possible. So I would like the city to follow that lead.
Thanks, Samantha. I'll just add a couple of things to what Samantha said. I think, one thing in particular that was really important that we learned about Seattle's effort, they've established, I think it's 3 or maybe 4, they call them tiny house villages that use a similar type of shelter pod to provide emergency housing. And they went through an effort several years ago to recognize that there are different types of emergency shelter that can be provided within a community, and that the process that we use to actually regulate those can be fine-tuned to the sort of level of investment of the shelter solution itself. They actually created a number of tiers from very, very low barrier, the shelter's only going to be in place for maximum of 6 months, to a longer term kind of solution, and even a solution that is specifically trying to enable the religious community in Seattle to be a major part of the housing, the emergency housing solution. So we didn't feel necessarily that we needed as many different types of emergency shelter categories. But when we were looking at just kind of the intent behind establishing a shelter pod community in Burlington and our existing standards for emergency shelter, as Samantha said, the kind of permitting requirements of that shelter pod is of an emergency shelter is pretty significant. And so what this amendment does is seeks to establish two different kind of categories of emergency shelter within our ordinance. One that's really intended to be more of a temporary facility, which we call an interim facility, and one that's meant to be more of a permanent facility like we would typically think of an emergency shelter being. And to establish kind of reciprocal standards for the different levels of those shelters. So I'll just pause there and I can describe the details of the ordinance amendment, but I do see that there's a hand if you'd like me to answer any opening questions for
Yes.
Samantha.
Eves, your hand is up.
Yeah, I've got some questions around this. First of all, who's going to be managing these pods and this shelter arrangement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Samantha, can you speak to that?
I can, so I think there's two different things. There's the zoning amendment, which is meant to refer to any, more than one potentially or any temporary emergency shelter. We at CEDO are working with a number of our partners that work on affordable housing and homelessness in the city to put together a team for managing the shelter community that we're proposing to bring forward this summer.
So in other words, there is no one who has stepped forward to manage this shelter.
We have not yet entered into a contract with anyone. We were talking with a number of agencies, and quite likely there will be a number of agencies involved. But I can't, I don't have any firm answer to give you.
So my recollection is that when Sears Lane when the city was looking to find someone to manage Sears Lane, no one would step forward. And
That's correct.
I'm just curious as to if this is meant to house the people who were displaced by Sears Lane, which we can all have different opinions on, but I don't necessarily consider that to have been a modicum of civility or a place where people should be living and the way that they were behaving, particularly in view of the meth that was there, the needles, etc. So I have to be honest, I personally feel that it's inappropriate not to go through a permitting process and to have some significant review so that the community can feel like there's real rules around this. Because I can tell you in all honesty, a couple of years ago, the city put a bunch of trailers down on North Avenue and North Beach. And I'll tell you, I live on North Avenue, and the traffic to and from those trailers was extraordinarily disruptive to the neighborhood and not a good thing. And so I apologize if I sound insensitive, but I don't feel that this is something that should just be thrown in place without any, first of all, very strong management and in a sense of there will be rules here and they will be enforced. And two, there should be a process where the community does get to weigh in to what is going to be done, where it's going to be, and how it's going to be administrated. I apologize, but that's my 2 cents.
Thanks.
So-
Anyone else? Oops.
I can speak to some of the kind of operational and management questions or points that Eve's raised. So in establishing the different categories of standards for interim and permanent facilities, the interim facilities are actually much more limited in terms of essentially what properties or who can apply for an interim facility. These are proposed to be limited while they would be allowed in many of the city zoning districts. They are proposed to be limited to property that's owned and controlled by the city or is a property that is under an active agreement with the city in order to operate a shelter like this. So there is kind of a standard. It's not just, anyone that wants to pop up a temporary shelter. It has to be something that's actively managed in cooperation with the city. The other piece of this is that unlike the conditional use standards in the zoning ordinance would look at things like traffic or certain kind of, we talk about character of the area as not always being a very clearly defined standard in terms of what it means as a standard for the DRB to review. One of the things that is proposed to be included in this is an extension of the requirement for emergency shelters right now. Emergency shelters do require on-site management at a ratio of 1 management person per every 25 beds. So that standard is proposed to be applicable here. And it also requires an approval of an operations plan by CEDO before a permit can be issued. So CEDO would be working to establish the standards for things like, you know, the on-site rules, you know, any kind of hours of operation or any of those standards that are necessary to make a site like that work well and work respectively for the residents that are living there and for the folks that are using it. So there are definitely some standards that are included here in terms of helping to manage the facility itself. The other piece I'll just say is that there are many different sections of the city's ordinance that kind of overlap in terms of how we permit individual projects. And actually, perfect timing, I see that Scott Guston just joined us, so he can chime in on this as well. But my understanding is that this project would still require a pre-application neighborhood meeting to happen. So there definitely would be opportunities for advance notice and input before an application is submitted. And there was something else I was going to say. Oh, and of course, as with every zoning permit, even if it's an administrative permit, there is a statutorily defined appeal period. So all of those things remain in place, even if we switch from a conditional to an administrative permit for that temporary facility.
Great. Yves, did you have a follow-up to your question or comments?
I do. You know, I again, and I'm sorry to be the turd in the punch bowl, but you know, 1 person to 25 beds sounds like a recipe for disaster, not a recipe for control. That's. I guess my question is, you know, CEDO approving it. Well, that's wonderful. I guess. You know, we're dealing with homelessness, we're dealing with poverty, we're dealing with mental illness, we're dealing with substance abuse. Is CEDO really the best person to judge whether something should move forward? Or should we be working with someone like the Howard Center, with COTS, one of the nonprofits who does this for you know, essentially a cause, and not entrusting this to CEDO? And again, I apologize, but I see the potential for disaster here. I understand trying to help people, but at the same time, I'm unfortunately, I'm the one who, ever since I've been on the planning commission, I've been talking about the challenges of getting a permit in the city of Burlington. And now what I'm presented with is CEDO saying, well, you know, this permitting process is really pretty rigorous, and so we don't want to go through it. Well, guess what? We created that permitting process. And so it doesn't seem kosher to me that the city gets to avoid it in this case, especially with something that could have a significant impact on both the neighborhood and our community. And I apologize, that's just my perspective.
Samantha, did you want to respond to that? And then I see Emily and Alex.
I just want to be on the record that CEDO isn't saying like we don't want to go through the permitting process. We're helping to move forward the mayor's agenda to make housing a human right in the city of Burlington. And the existing permitting process for emergency shelters, as we've seen in other places across the country, I don't think is the appropriate permitting process for something temporary. As Megan was saying, like the conditional use approval has a lot to do with the appearance of the structure, like how it's laid out on the site, lots of things that absolutely make sense are important for any landowner, including the city, to go through when they design and build a permanent structure. These aren't permanent structures, and so that's the reason that we are requesting this kind of change. And in terms of the management, CEDO definitely is not in the business of doing this management. That's not what we're proposing, but we are very strongly connected with a lot of partners throughout the city of Burlington and throughout the county who are providing housing and services. And we'll have management plans in place that are approved by the Continuum of Care and the state's Office of Economic Opportunity, by people who are professionals and experts in this area. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I think, Emily, you had your hand, and then after you will go to Alex.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add on that, you know, next to my house at the former Ethan Allen Club, when it was the Ethan Allen Club, that was a low barrier shelter for a while. And I believe it had to go through the regular permitting process, but it was an existing building. And I can share that it was not an ideal neighbor. There were, you know, there were fire trucks and ambulances there almost every night. There, you know, there were homeless people coming to the neighborhood to get a place to sleep, and people who were drunk and on drugs. So with that said, you know, our neighborhood welcomed the low barrier shelter. And I think if we make any opportunity for things such as the visual nature of the building, or, you know, nitpicky details of the shelter, what's going to happen is that the neighborhoods that are affluent have the resources and time to show up to meetings and complain. The squeaky wheel's going to get oiled, and those neighborhoods with the resources are not going to house these low barrier shelters. And so I want to be sure that you know, if there is any discretion or process, that it's really related to things that matter about the homeless shelter, and that every single community in Burlington carries a fair share of the responsibility of taking on the homeless crisis that we are feeling in Burlington. So I guess I would be really cautious about the ways that we would allow neighbors to weigh in. And I know, I mean, having had it myself, I know the reality is that nobody, no homeowner, no property owner is going to be rejoicing about a low barrier shelter being next to their house. And so I think we have to be really careful about what discretion we give.
Any comments to that, or I could go to Alex next. Alex?
What Emily just said actually raises a question in my mind. With these emergency use shelters, is that effectively a low barrier shelter? Or, you know, what I wanted to say in response to Eve's was, does this mean if we, you know, approve this zoning change, does that open the barn door wide to, you know, by right construction of an emergency use, you know, grouping of tiny homes, or is there going to be further review and approval? I feel like people need to be housed somewhere. This seems like a decent way to do it. I have to agree with you, Eves, about, you know, that we have a permitting process and we shouldn't just change it willy-nilly because the city asks us to. That's what I have to say.
So I think if I'm understanding your question right, Alex, you know, this is not eliminating the need for any permits. A low bear shelter like this, an interim emergency shelter, would still be required to get a zoning permit and probably other permits as well, building permits, other types of permits. The main difference here is that instead of having a set of standards that are typically meant for larger scale, more intensive scale development in front of the development review board, there's a more streamlined and clear set of standards that would be reviewed essentially by Scott and his team.
I just want to add, I think there's an important component to this is that they have to be reviewed annually, that the permit is only giving you permission to use for that use for 1 year, and then it can be renewed. It has to be renewed annually.
And what would the standards be for deciding whether or not to issue the permit, or if a permit's been issued on the annual review to say, yes, it could continue, or no, it needs to stop? What standards would go with that?
So it would be the list of standards that are here in the interim facilities column. So they would be looking again at property ownership or some kind of an agreement with the city. We would be looking at, and if something is being renewed, this obviously isn't applicable necessarily every single year, but the site area and screening requirements, limitations on the number of guests that would be allowed at the site, limitations on the kind of duration of stay of the guests themselves, with some provision for extension if there's no alternative housing available. The on-site management piece is the last big piece. So I think especially if we're considering renewing the permit, we could also, include something about having, an affirmative letter of support from, CEDO or whomever approved the management plan for the facility in the first place for it to continue.
So what happens, like, if there were, just whatever the problems might be, lots of problems over the course of the year, and a lot of complaints over the time, and justifiable complaints for whatever they might be. Is that something that would be considered in deciding whether or not to renew it for another year? Or is that something that's not here to be considered?
There is nothing that is specific to this zoning ordinance that would say, these are the types of issues that may or may not have been dealt with in the last year that need to be addressed in that renewal process. But again, I think CEDO would be working with these other housing organizations to establish standards for the operation of these facilities as well. We don't have a similar comparable process of requiring a lot of zoning permits to get annual renewals. Typically, it's issued, and if you violate either a standard of the city's zoning ordinance or a condition of the permit, you can receive a zoning violation. So Scott, I don't know what your thoughts are on if any of these sort of issues that we're hearing about would rise to the level of a zoning amendment, or if they would be more of quality of life complaints.
Well, the urban reserve, I guess I'll go backwards in your points. So the urban reserve doesn't allow zoning permits to be valid for any longer than 2 years. And so every 2 years, the Department of Public Works needs to reapply to do snow storage down there for the winter months. Prior permits don't have any bearing. It's not an extension. The permit's valid for 2 years and then expires. You need to reapply anew. So what I'm looking at here in the table, I don't see anything that would be considered for an extension that isn't considered for the initial 1-year approval. So in the few minutes I've been on this, I've heard a lot of concern about quality of life considerations is not in here. Maybe it should be. I'll point out that's why permanent facilities are conditional use, which do address those items. But the interim facilities don't address that. And, that's a policy choice for you all to make, whether and how that should be part of the equation here, either initially and or for renewal of the interim.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, part of the goal for the interim is to bypass the more rigorous process because it's short term. But if that's the case, then we want to make sure that, 2, 3, 4 years, I mean, it's really not that short term. So even 5 years isn't that short term. So, if things are going well, that's one thing. But if things aren't going well, there ought to be a way to address that. And, could reflect on whether a permit should be renewed. And that, frankly, I think would help encourage people, the city or whoever has the permit to really maintain it and manage it in a way that will help assure it gets renewed. If you don't take any of that into consideration, then almost what does it mean to have it, interim, an interim permit? Just it gets to be renewed every year. But if you have the operating agreement with the city, then you could get it renewed. It doesn't seem like there's a very big standard for renewal. And yet there may be a lot of history of knowing that it's going really well, and so obviously it should be renewed. You know, even if it's in a neighborhood that might not otherwise want it, if everything's going smooth, of course it should be renewed. But if, you know, even if it's in a neighborhood that really, really would like a facility like that there, but it's just causing big problems, you know, for noise or for whatever reason, that those kinds of things ought to be considered in deciding whether or not to renew the permit again for another year. Emily?
So I think that the nature of the problem is it causes problems, that there is noise, that there are disruptions, that, you know, you're going to have fire trucks showing up, you're going to have police cars showing up, and that's just a reality of the problem. And dealing with homelessness, it exists, and it's existing downtown right now. Like when my dad was sick and I had to walk down through downtown every single night at 7 o'clock, and then I would walk back at 8 or 9 or 10. Every single night downtown, there's fire trucks and ambulances and things going on because of the homelessness crisis. So all of those things are happening. It's just a matter of where they're happening. And I think that you can't address homelessness and you can't address the addiction problem without facing some of the realities of what the situation is. And so if you open it up to neighborhoods and people not, you know, complaining about the ambulance showing up, that just pushes the problem somewhere else. And it's going to push the problem to the lowest income neighborhoods in our community and the places where people have the least ability to show up and to advocate for themselves, where there's the highest percentage of renters and where there's the most turnover. And I guess that's happening now because it's happening downtown. So I'm very sensitive to discretion from neighborhoods about some of the things that I think are just part of dealing with homelessness. It's like, this exists and it's everywhere, and you can push it somewhere else, but it exists. You're just pushing it into another part of town.
I think those are good points, but I also think that there is potentially opportunities for putting some kind of standards. You know, perhaps it's not whether there are ambulances or fire trucks that come. Maybe that's not the right standard to build into something like this, but I do think it's at least worth considering what kind of standards there may be, you know, and it may, you know, if you're within certain areas, you know, like a lot of the primary places it looks like for the interim facilities is on city controlled property, which I assume primarily probably means city park areas or places like that, you know, and those could be, you know, perhaps one set of standards for something like that. And if something's right in the middle of a neighborhood, you know, maybe another standard that, and I don't necessarily know what those should be, but I think it's worth looking at and seeing, you know, are there things to place on this? Because I also think that will give people some level of assurance that these things can work in neighborhoods, not just in isolated city park, you know, parts of city parks, but if they're trying to put this in a neighborhood or somewhere like that, that, you know, there's something that could be looked at to say, yeah, you know, these are the kinds of things that could work. Without it, people are just, you won't have any place to look, and people are just going to, I think, get frightened by this.
Yeah, we can talk to, you know, Samantha and I can follow up on whether there are some sort of what I'll call like management standards that could be called out for inclusion in the initial, you know, approval as well as a renewal. You know, there were a number of things that we saw in the examples from Seattle that we didn't include here because we didn't really think it was the role of zoning to be specifying some of these standards. But we could go back and take a look at what some of those management standards were and see if they may be an appropriate fit for just, you know, a review for a more administrative permit process.
Well, you know, it may be that some of these things don't fit in the zoning, but whether it's in zoning or in the code, it should be somewhere. And I think maybe that's one of the questions and one of the issues is, you know, where should some of these things live, whether it's in the zoning or whether it's in some other code. but I think there ought to be something, some benchmarks, just especially when it's just a administrative review. But thanks for taking that on. I also have another question on the interim facilities. It says it needs to be on property owned or controlled by the city, or on private property with an operating agreement with the city for an interim shelter. What do you envision for an operating agreement like that? Like, who could get one and how do you get one?
Do you want to address that, Samantha?
Sure. I think the operating agreement would be sort of a memorandum of understanding between a landowner and the city that laid out the plan for the interim shelter facility, and I think has this additional management plan to be approved by the city. So I see it as a memorandum of understanding. I think this is in response to just wanting to not see Sears Lane return. I think we can all agree that that was not a successful shelter situation for anybody, and certainly not for our public safety folks that were having to respond to that. So wanting to just be clear that it was something the city had understanding of and understood how it was going to be maintained and operated.
Great, thanks.
And I think just one of your other comments that you made, you were thinking about city-owned property as parks. The reality is the majority of the sites that we've identified and are sort of working through due diligence on are actually mostly city-owned parking lots.
Okay, that can make sense as well. I think my last question for right now is on the administrative review process. There were comments about making sure the public knows about it, and Megan, I think you mentioned that there'd still have to be going to like the NPAs or something like that. How is that specified in here? I don't see that in this.
Yeah, I think when I mentioned that, it was specifically relating to other standards in our ordinance. So there are different thresholds for either the scale and scope of development or the cost of development that trigger different permit types. And so there are different requirements that are associated with different permit types as well. And so I think, if Scott can either confirm that we maybe would still be triggering that, and if not, we could incorporate that as a standard into the interim use table.
Well, the NPA meaning requirement is based on unit count or size. I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's 5 or more dwelling units.
Yeah.
Or more than 10,000 square feet. I don't know offhand if this proposal on Elmwood trips either one of those.
So I might suggest that somehow to make sure that if there is going to be the administrative review, that there's that there's an opportunity to let the public know, whether it's through the NPAs or some level more than just like the standard notice you might give on a small development administratively approved thing, but to just make sure that there's a community notice of some sort, community involvement of some sort, even if it stays as administratively reviewed.
Okay. Yeah, and if nothing else, I think one of the things that we could do is just make sure that it's explicitly clear that it relates back to the other part of the ordinance that requires that meeting.
Yeah, that could work. Anyone else? Eves, are you? I see you.
Yeah, I'm raising my hand again.
Okay.
I guess what I'd say is that, I want to echo what you said. To me, look, at the end of the day, no matter where this goes, it's going to be disruptive to that neighborhood. And I think we owe it to the neighborhoods to allow them to weigh in. So it's not just a notice. I think there needs to be a public forum wherever we're putting one of these. the public needs to know and be invited to come and at least present their views and ask their questions and be reassured. Because otherwise it's a non-starter. I mean, honestly, you can't just inflict this on a neighborhood and say, hey, we're doing this tough shit. It doesn't work that way, or it shouldn't work that way. I don't think that's fair to anyone. Because at the end of the day, it's fine to do it, but it's got to be done in a way that's controllable and in a way where there are rules. And I disagree, you know, not substantively with Emily, but I don't think it's okay to say, oh, great, you know, oh yeah, we'll get the ambulances and the fire trucks. They'll be here on a regular basis. Look, those services are all strapped. They don't have enough people. So putting an additional burden on them is not fair either. This has to go through a process. You know, we're talking about parking requirements being really important, having to go through a process. This is putting a bunch of people in a neighborhood who we all can realistically acknowledge are going to have significant issues and be a disturbance and a problem in that neighborhood. And we can't just do that to the citizens. They need, look, it's okay to do it, but they have to be able to weigh in and at least lay out some conditions for that acceptance. I mean, you would all want that if it was going in your backyard, wouldn't you? Wherever you live. So how is it wrong to ask us to do it?
Do you know, Samantha, from any of the experiences of other communities that have been able to use these sort of temporary facilities, these managed temporary facilities, if they have had a difference in terms of the outcomes or the experience for residents living in them?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we wouldn't be trying to pursue this effort if that weren't the case. I think that there is lots of research that shows that a lot of the underlying issues that lead to homelessness, and folks who are homeless in the city of Burlington are also citizens and residents of the city. They just don't currently have a home. So a lot of the underlying issues that lead to homelessness cannot be addressed while a person doesn't have the safety and security of shelter. So if you don't have a place to put your belongings and know where you're going to sleep at night, it's very difficult to attend meetings with social service providers, mental health providers, a job interview, all of these things that are necessary for addressing the underlying issues of homelessness cannot be addressed until someone has safe and secure shelter. So the places that have been implementing these there's a fair amount of data that shows, I think, at least 50% of folks are making it into permanent housing within 9 months of entering this type of shelter community, because they have that safe and secure shelter with on-site services. They don't have to travel to a service appointment. The services are provided for them on site. They have an opportunity to build relationships with the folks that are best equipped to help them. And that allows them to take advantage of those services that are available.
And I think one other question that I have for you is, you know, the shelter that was set up at North Beach Campground during the early days of the COVID state of emergency, has CEDO been working with the folks that ran that to take any lessons learned from that? Because this strikes me as a similar example in terms of, you know, they brought RVs and it was a managed site with facilities. Have you talked to them about any lessons learned about that experience?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was operated sort of by, was operated by CBOEO in coordination with the parks facility, because obviously it was on parks land, and CBOEO is definitely an active partner in this process and will, again, I don't I can't, we haven't settled on agreements, but most likely we'll be providing services directly on site, and yes, has active and often input on how this can be successful. Everybody wants it to be successful.
Alex?
Eads also has his hand up. A quick question for Samantha. Have there been any discussions between the city and nonprofits like Howard Center or Camp Champlain Housing Trust to act as a manager for a site like this?
Yes. So
Awesome.
those discussions are ongoing. I think as everyone, has recognized, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. It's a big challenge, and it's going to take all of us, all of these different folks working together to end homelessness, to come together and make this a success. And that's what we're working on, bringing those folks to the table, or they're at the table. We're working on figuring out how to best move forward.
Yves, is your hand up again?
It is, Andy. I guess my question is, my understanding is that those campers that the city leased or bought or whatever were absolutely trashed. And I'd like to know if that is indeed the case.
I wasn't
understanding.
working at the city at that time, so
It's a
I
fair
don't
question
have
to
any.
ask, though. I think it certainly should be fresh on people's memory. And if it hasn't been asked, it should be asked.
Anyone else? So there's been a variety of feedback, and I understand that when we began the meeting, Megan, you had said that this was for both this item and the next item. It's more or less the introduction. So I imagine we get feedback and comments back, or further revisions from Samantha and from you, Megan and Scott, on this.
Yeah, I think the main things that I'm hearing is, desire to see if there's a way to either incorporate or refer to some type of management standards that would be reviewed, even if administratively reviewed at the outset of a permit and at the annual renewal. And then a way to ensure that there is neighborhood notice about the location of an interim facility as well, even if it's an administrative review. So I can follow up with Samantha and Scott and talk to them about some potential additions or modifications that we can make to bring back to you.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, that sounds good. So we will close out this item. Look forward to more information at a future meeting. We'll go on to item 6, which is proposed CDO amendment, Burlington High School zoning. And Samantha, thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you very
and
much.
sharing this with us.
Okay, and I'm also just inviting Joe White is here. Joe is with White and Burke. He attended your meeting last week to support the school district's request for consideration of a zoning amendment at the Institute Road site. So he's here actually just to help answer questions if you have them for the design team. But I will kick us off with a discussion about what's in this package for the BHS zoning. So you received communication from the school district at your last meeting about the fact that they have selected the Institute Road site and are actively working on some concept planning for the property. And that some of their early investigations of the property have indicated that their efforts to find a really suitable place on the property to put a new modern high school have presented some challenges in terms of the existing zoning of the site and the small kind of tight box that they would be limited to if they were to rely simply on their existing nonconformities and their statutory exemptions. So the commission at your meeting last week encouraged the district to kind of say, what are the things that would be necessary in order to help facilitate the redevelopment of a modern school at that site. And what is in your packet is an attempt by the staff to help kind of draft an amendment that is responsive to some of the main issues that they have identified with the current site and the current zoning of that site. So to start at kind of the highest level, the proposed amendment is to change the zoning of the 52 Institute Road property, which is actually, and this is something that Joe and I have talked about, it's either one parcel or two parcels, but it's the north and south side of the intersection of North Street and Institute Road. Currently the site of the high school and the athletic facilities. So the proposal is to change the zoning for that site from the Recreation Conservation District that currently applies to it to the institutional zoning district. The institutional zoning district is the kind of base zoning district that currently applies to the UVM, Champlain, and Medical Center campuses, as well as some of the residential areas that immediately surround those campuses as well. This also proposes to apply an overlay zone that establishes specific standards for the 52 Institute Road site that help them address some of the unique opportunities and challenges of the site. And as you may remember from a meeting a couple of meetings ago, we talked about some of the institutional campus overlay districts in the context of Trinity campus. So an overlay zone kind of sits on top of a base zoning district and presents modified standards for a specific area within that zoning district. So that's what this proposes. And there are a number of maps that indicate how the property would be rezoned and all the kind of applicable districts that would be impacted by a change from RCO to institutional. The rest of the amendment then establishes what those standards actually would be for the high school overlay district. It starts with a purpose statement, which is about the facilitation of the high school at the current location of the city's public high school. It talks about kind of the intent in terms of how that development would be incorporated on the site. And then lays out specific standards for lot coverage, setbacks, height, and uses on the property or within that overlay zoning district. So that's what you see on the rest of the pages here of this attachment that we sent to you yesterday. Many of the standards that are in here are similar to what you heard the district request at your last meeting. So for lot coverage, the proposed lot coverage in this overlay would be 60%, and that would apply to all of the properties within the overlay zoning district. It would apply at least a 20-foot setback from North Avenue and Institute Road, and establish side and rear setbacks for those properties of 10 and 20 feet respectively. And kind of starts with the assumption that the school district presented to you of allowing a 60-foot height limit for the facility. One of the things that I had mentioned to you in the last meeting is that there are some challenges with the site in terms of how much the topography slopes as you move away from North Avenue across Institute Road. I guess I'll say run up against how we measure height within the zoning ordinance. And so one of the things that we have been talking with the district about is kind of as they develop the conceptual planning, if we may need to consider having another height limit set back from the road some distance to help them kind of facilitate a building like a high school moving across a slope like that and remaining kind of one level building rather than like you see at the site today, a series of buildings that are sort of stepped across the topography. So that's the main reason why you see two different ideas for a height limit here to help us or help them kind of identify an opportunity for dealing with that grade change. And then as far as the uses here, the proposed uses that have been suggested to be allowed in this district are aimed at providing flexibility for a school facility to be located here, as well as for the potential in the future for some of the district's uses or other services to potentially be located at the site as well. This is really intended to kind of look towards the future at what else might be compatible uses with a school on a civic property in that location of the city. Any of the sort of district operations or office spaces would be able to be accommodated within the uses that are allowed here. We don't have to specifically call out things like an office building or a public works garage. They would be enabled as part of these uses here, but is really intended to give them the maximum flexibility for how to evolve the school's property. And that is what is in front of you. So happy to take some questions.
Great. Questions, comments from the commission? Not seen much. Okay. Alex, you,
May I ask a question?
yes.
Do you have an idea of what the current lot coverage is now?
Yeah, Joe might be able to help answer that question, but is it around 35%?
Yeah, I think it's around 35%. I believe that's what the staff memo from the last go around had indicated.
I guess, I'm just sort of, this is a very different animal than most other zoning questions because this site is isolated. There's not a lot of other buildings around it. There's a forest on one side and athletic fields and a cemetery on the other side. So it's not like Church Street where you'd be concerned about height limit in relation to the neighboring structures. The setback from North Avenue, I guess that was my only question when the last time you came to talk to us was, unless you put up a tower right on North Avenue, I don't see the concern. I go back to what Andy said about the height limit on other institutional zones like the University of Vermont, where it doesn't matter how tall the building is because it's set far way back in the campus. So maybe that's somewhat the case here, but I guess I don't see a lot of precedent from other zoning areas to guide us here. So I mean, my feeling is, unless somebody has some really strong objections to what you're proposing here, we should move this forward. Anybody else?
Anyone else?
So we do have some other details that are not incorporated in here. So for example, if the commission is open to considering the potential for, sort of one height limit closer to North Avenue and another height limit set back further from the avenue. I think that the school district is still very much in some of the conceptual phases of their work and doesn't have a good sense yet for what would be either limiting or helpful in terms of considering a stepped height limit. So we don't have those details to fill in tonight. But I think, Joe could speak to the process that the school district is under right now and maybe when some of those details could be presented to help us round this out.
Sure. Yeah, so the design team is currently in the conceptual design phase. And the schedule right now is that they will be delivering, I think, probably 3 or 4 different conceptual design options for the property by the end of this month. And the plan is to present those to the school board at their first meeting. I think it's April 5th, with the hope that the school board by mid-April will make a decision on which conceptual design option they want to move forward with to the more detailed design phase, the schematic design phase. So we should have a pretty good idea by the end of March, or a better idea, I think, on what the what the potential Building heights would be, building heights, closer to North Avenue versus further back where, the topography slopes downward quite significantly. We'll have a better idea of where parking's going to be located, a better idea of what the total lot coverage is likely to look like. So we should be able to start filling in some of those blanks that Megan left open in this first draft, probably by early April.
Cool.
And Alex, your observation is an interesting one, just about the location of the site and its neighboring development, right? That one of the things that we were looking at and thinking about things like setbacks in particular was, just what we see in some other locations nearby along North Avenue. So, the obvious example just being the condos across the street. There are some single family homes across the street. There are some other single family homes, further south on North Avenue. And then we obviously have the new Cambrian Rise development and the standards for the neighborhood activity center that applies where Cambrian Rise is. So some of those dimensional standards that apply around kind of in the vicinity of the high school, not immediate neighbors necessarily, but in the vicinity, were things that we kind of look to see, to ask questions about compatibility. And then of course there are just, unique needs related to a school, for example. One of the things that Scott and I learned from talking with the district about this is just, how tall an auditorium has to be. That, certain height limits that we might put in place would just significantly constrain the ability to even build an auditorium in a school. So we're trying to do things that make this kind of resemble other standards that we see along North Avenue, but also recognize some things are going to have to be kind of unique.
Thank you.
So from my perspective, I think the standards you're laying out for the school, all seem fine to me. There's obviously more details that have to be added to it, but there's nothing in those standards, at least right now, that that cause me any concern. So I think you took what we suggested of ask us for what you need, and I think it's working. My one question though really is on the scope of the permitted uses that are here.
Mm-hmm.
The whole goal of this was really to help support a new high school in this space, and to the extent that these uses are all ones that directly support the high school, that's one thing, and that's fine. But for example, I'm not sure this is a site where we'd want a standalone auto body shop or the auto vehicle repair shop. We're really looking at these standards to help support a high school that's there. So you may want to go look at some of these uses and either make sure that there is, an ancillary use to the high school. I don't know, actually I should know, but I don't know if our high school had, auto shop as part of the curriculum.
Did you take that class?
I didn't. I actually did in my high school, but if it did, for something like that, obviously that's fine. But as a standalone, I don't know that it should just be a permitted use. I'm not sure if it should be a use at all. If anything, maybe a conditional use. So I just suggest looking at some of the things that are listed as permitted use, and either making sure that it's, as part of the school itself, or whether it really should be a permitted use or a conditional use or not a use at all in there. So I don't necessarily have answers for any of these, but just would ask to take a look at the use table and just make sure it's all consistent with the location. But other than that, I think, for the high school part of it itself, I think this is all on the right track.
Yeah, I think so. Just one quick response, Andy. I think your point is right that many of these activities could be allowed as accessory uses essentially to the school, or even could be contemplated as being part of the primary purpose of the school. The BTC, for example, it is an academic auto body shop. So I think I don't have a lot of concerns about kind of tightening the scope of this table in terms of how it would influence the school's ability to implement its own programming there, or even expand some of the school-based programming that's there. I think part of what we were trying to think about too is just, you know, if ever some portion of these properties are not for the high school. I mean, I'm not saying that this is part of the school's intent, but it's just one of the things that you contemplate as part of a zoning policy decision is, you know, if the school weren't there, then what? And there are definitely a broader range of uses that would be allowed in the underlying institutional zoning district than what would be allowed in this table here. And so this is a, you know, it's a narrowing and kind of a filtering of what those base uses are that would be permitted on the site. So I guess that is a question for the planning commission is, you know, if it weren't school-based, would you want to see this list of uses filtered?
I'd suggest, and I obviously want to hear from the others, but I'd suggest that, you know, our goal here is to help facilitate a high school and a school being here. And I would imagine a school's going to be there. Either the school's going to get ultimately built there or not. And if it is, I think those questions could be put off, you know, for quite a while. And if it's not going to be built, then I think we really want to go back and revisit, you know, a lot of this anyhow. So I just, for myself, suggest the goal here is really the high school or a school, and any of the other uses could come up at another time if need be. You know, we could always, you know, amend the zoning again to allow for some other uses if we want to expand the use table out. I also think that, you know, given that this is a city property, and it's going to be city officials that decide what this is going to go, and they're going to go to a city official to decide, you know, to either grant the permit or not grant the permit. I think some level of, you know, conditional use or something that's outside of just one city official after another deciding uses other than, you know, the high school related uses might not be a bad idea if we're putting them in. But just food for thought. Anyone else? Emily, Eves, Alex? Alex?
I just thought they should be permitted if they were, you know, ancillary, you know, as part of, provided as part of high school. Like that's the whole point of having a body shop there.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. If it's part of the high school, I have no problem with that. If they just, you know, if they want to just put if the city wants to put like a public works garage on another part of the property, I think
that should be different.
That's different.
Right. So, I mean, I'm in favor of, you know, changing the zoning to allow a high school, and, you know, whether or not the city, somebody comes up with $200 million to build it, that's not a question, is up to us.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, good. Joe.
Yeah, just one comment. I totally understand what you guys are saying, and I know it's definitely the district's desire, or the primary desire, is for this to be a high school and tech center, and any uses that are ancillary to that, you know, for example, an auto repair, that is one of the curriculums at BTC. But you know, if there ever was an opportunity maybe for them to you know, allow some residents to bring their cars in, maybe it'd be a revenue source for them to work on their cars, but also an educational aspect to that. So I don't know if that's kind of a gray area between, is it strictly high school or does it open it up to something else? But, you know, we'll certainly consider that. You know, something else that has come out quite a bit in the visioning workshops that have been held is, you know, allowing community use of the high school facilities. And, you know, maybe they even do it already, but things like, you know, allowing adult basketball leagues or something to use the gyms during the year. You know, they talked about maybe yoga classes that are open to the community, you know, cooking classes, maybe things like that. I don't know, but also having some aspect of community use for the building has been thrown out there as something that's desirable. So that might be something we might want to talk to you about further.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna put that out there.
I mean, I'll just say from my perspective, all of that is all, to me, is all part of a high school. You know, it's a
Okay.
community high school. So I think it, at least for me, what I'm talking about is more of, you know, not a like an auto shop that's part of the high school. And yeah, even community members may bring, because you're right, that's a great learning opportunity for the kids. It's more of a standalone that's really not associated with the high school.
Yeah, totally.
That's really what I'm getting at. That's, you know,
Agreed.
something different. But anything that's part of the high school, you know, anything that's part of the educational process, anything that's part of integrating the school in with the community, I think all that's fair game.
Great.
It should be. Good. Anyone else before we close this out? Okay. Well, great. Joe, thanks for coming, and we look forward to seeing how this progresses from your end.
Great. Thanks.
All right, and thanks to all of you as commissioners for bearing with me. I know that the materials for these two items came to you much later than we like them to. So as I said at the top, I'm really looking forward to having another planner in the office.
Yes. Well, we did get it before the meeting, so that's good. So we'll close out that item. We're on to item 7, which are commissioner items. Our next two meetings are March 22nd and April 12th. And there's an ordinance committee meeting on March 3rd. Any other commissioner items?
Oh, there was an ordinance committee.
Oh, there
meeting.
was an ordinance committee meeting on March 3rd. You're right. I'm behind the times.
I don't know
Anyone
if
else?
Anybody wanted to give an update on what they talked about at the ordinance committee meeting? Maybe
I
Scott.
wasn't there. Mary covered it for me.
Okay.
But we brought up the topic of public art within the form code. We need to make a little carve out to allow it outside of the otherwise highly prescriptive standards of the form code.
Okay, good. Anyone else? Then we'll move on to item 8, minutes of communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept communications?
I would
Motion
move
by
to accept them.
Alex, seconded by Emily. Raise your hand. Seconded by Emily. Thank you. All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have our minutes of communications, and item 9 is adjournment. Motion by Emily, seconded by Alex. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Stand adjourned. Thank you all for coming, and thanks, Scott. Thanks, Megan. And see you at our next meeting. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.